Hey, Joe here from Home Studio Corner. Let's talk about mid-range. Mid-range is the culprit behind almost every muddy mix that you've ever produced. And mid-range can be tricky because everything's in the mid-range to some extent. So when I'm thinking about mid-range, I'm thinking probably in like the 200 to 900 hertz range or thereabouts. Everything below 200 feels more like low-end bass stuff to me. Everything above 900 feels like maybe upper mid-range and then high frequencies. But the low mids are what give us a lot of trouble, especially when we're starting out mixing. So I'm going to talk to you with a couple things to help you navigate the mid-range a little bit better. Why is the mid-range so problematic? Well, every instrument you're going to record, especially if you're doing a lot of mixing of recorded instruments, if you're using a lot of samples and synths and things like that, it gets a little easier. But recorded instruments, every instrument, a voice, a guitar, a drum, a bass, they all have fundamental frequencies, which means kind of the core frequency of that sound. Now, it has lots of, like my voice, for example, it kind of sits in the low mid-range, but then there's also a lot of upper mid-range and high-frequency content that allows you to hear me. Otherwise, it would just be and you couldn't understand anything. But there's a presence of all those frequencies, but the bulk of the energy is down in the low mids. That's why if you add that onto a guitar, which has its fundamental frequency in that low mid-range, and then a bunch of background vocals and a bunch of keyboards and you're just piling on mid-range. If you think of it visually, here's the lows, here's the mids, here's the highs. If you had everything just set at the same volume, you would have a bump in the mid-range most likely, because that's where the bulk of the energy is in a mix. So part of what we're trying to do as we mix is to make that mid-range feel more balanced, to where we're hearing the lows, the mids, and the highs in a more balanced fashion, as opposed to the mid-range being the loudest thing. That's what we call a muddy mix, when the low mids especially are louder than everything else. Now, you can't do this visually. You can't use a frequency readout to do this. It requires effort and skill. Those tools can be helpful, but I've never mixed a song based on what I see. It always has to be on what you hear. That's where you're going to get the balance, okay? So the problem a lot of people face with mid-range is they don't really know what it sounds like. When you first start out mixing and someone says, "Do you know what 100 hertz sounds like?" You'll say, "Yeah, I do." But if we went in and actually listened to 100 hertz, you'd probably change your mind. I was that way with like 500. I had this idea of what 500 hertz sounds like. To me, 500 hertz was low end and thickness and beefy and kick drum. But no, 500 hertz is more like the boxiness of a drum. It's the kind of the next step up from the low end. It's a lot higher than I thought. It's kind of like, ooh, kind of in there versus down there. And that was just a perception that I had, and I would make mixing decisions based on the fact that I thought 500 hertz was a lot lower than it was. Once I familiarized myself with what the different frequency ranges sounded like, I was able to make better mixing decisions based on that. So that's what we're going to do in this video. Really, the only way to get good, especially when it comes to frequency stuff, which means how you're going to use EQ, is you got to know what the different frequency ranges sound like so you can know which frequencies are giving you a problem, and then you'll know how to go in and listen for those frequencies to make the changes you need to make to get your mixes to sound much more balanced. Let's dive in and I'll show you something. Here's the mastering session for my EP Fighter that I released last year. And we're going to pull up this song, which is called, what is it? This is Listen. So it's a pretty full song, there are lots of frequencies here, gives us a lot to work with. So here's what that sounds like really quick. Now, there's no substitute for simply the amount of time you need to spend training your ears. I don't mean sitting down with like an app that like teaches you frequencies. I don't find that to be terribly helpful. But sitting down and really intentionally trying to learn what the different frequency ranges sound like. You can do that by just mixing a lot of songs and playing with EQ and boosting a frequency to see what's there and then bringing it back down. But this is one thing that at least just I want to get you moving in the right direction. I think this will help. So I've got a plug in here. This is a multi-band compressor. which means, I talked about that in a recent video, a multiband compressor is a compressor that allows you to compress different frequency ranges differently. We're not using it for compression today. We're actually using it because it has these cute little mute and solo buttons on each frequency range. So I've divided these up into 3 bands. The low band is from 0 to 200. The mid band is 200 to 900, and the high band is 900 and above. So I'm going to hit play and go through each solo each band so you can hear what that sounds like. And then I'll come back out of it, and then I'll solo the next one. So we'll start with the lows, then the mids, then the highs, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay? Here we go. If you're being honest with yourself, probably one or perhaps all 3 of those was a surprise to you. Even now, as I'm sitting here and I listen, I think there's a lot more vocal in the lows than I expected. There's you can actually hear the vocal down there below 200. And then the mid-range was a lot lighter than I expect. I'm even still, I told you the story about 500 hertz. I'm still surprised by how little low end there is in the 200 to 900 category. And yet, this frequency range is the culprit for most muddy mixes. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to take this frequency range, and there's a gain knob here. I'm just going to turn it up, and we're going to hear what most muddy mixes sound like. It's not the low end. Usually, that's the problem. It's the low mids that build up too much. Let's see what that sounds like. It just brings up a lot of nastiness. You can hear like the ambient guitars in the background. You can hear a lot more of just like stuff that you need to have in the mix. If we muted out the mid-range, it would be weird. So clearly the mid-range is important, but when it's too loud, it just makes everything feel less professional. One quick word of warning. I encourage you to do this in your own system. Figure out a way to listen to each frequency range and familiarize yourself with it. Once you do, your tendency is going to be to take too much mid-range out. Your tendency will be to then go do this and give your mix that smiley face EQ where it's got lots of lows and lots of highs and no mids. Here's what that would sound like. It's just not pleasant. I mean, it's not horrible. Yeah, it's pretty horrible. So when you're doing that, the temptation's going to be to overcompensate by bringing out too much of the mid-range. Don't do that. Just get it to where it's not too loud and it's more balanced with the lows and the highs. When I hear mixes from people who are new to mixing and there's a problem, it's usually one of two things. Either there's too much mid-range and it's muddy, or there's not enough mid-range and it sounds harsh on the top end and then just tubby on the bottom end. What are you doing? Come here. You say hi? Oh, and then we got our mix assistant here. This is Maggie. Say hi. 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 What you got there?
My mermaid.
A mermaid? Do mermaids like muddy mixes?
No.
No, of course not. All right, get out of here. Anyway, that's it for me. I hope that was helpful for you. If you don't have a system in how you approach your mixes, if you don't have a process, you need to check out my 5-step mix guide. Just go to 5stepmix.com. It's short, it's free, and it'll help you systemize the way you approach your mixes so you can do stuff like this, get the mixes done in a reasonable amount of time, and see a constant improvement to the sound quality of your mixes. Go check it out now, and I'll see you around. Bye.